Herb, in your book, you seem to reject many of the typical interventions or practices that people who work with people with severe and profound disabilities use: behavior modification, behavior management, making rewards contingent on certain behavior. Have you always felt that that was an inappropriate way of interacting with people with disabilities?
I wasn't trained to. And I should make one qualifier to that, in that I have no argument with behavior modification. I have no argument with contingencies, so long as they're socially ordinary.
What do you mean by that?
For instance, there are programs where if you have a bad day at work, you can't watch television at night. That doesn't make any sense to me for adults. I mean, that's just not a socially ordinary contingency. But if you want to go on a picnic with somebody and you've just beaten them up, chances are they're going to be less eager to go have a sandwich with you. That feels like an ordinary, and it's not a pre-designed, rigorously pursued thing. It's just, I don't want to do that.
Do those tend to be powerful enough contingencies or reinforcers so that they really have the impact you want to in eliminating the negative behavior or establishing better behavior?
If they don't, then it's really saying what your relationship is about. I mean, there are people in some relationships where a raised eyebrow causes a change in pulse and respiration. Is like, what did I do? And I think we respond to each other as much as we value each other. And it's that sense that. But if I walk in off the street and say, well, what a wonderful afternoon, you're going on a picnic with me. You may look forward to that, but you might not, too. I don't see that as... But oftentimes that's described as a positive social experience, and it sounds nice, but it may not be nice.
Was there a time when you were less concerned about whether response to somebody's behavior was socially ordinary?
I think what happened was I got into business... I started out... went to graduate school to be a clinical psychologist. I had all of this clinical background, and I got to meet people with developmental disabilities by force. I was assigned to do a couple of days a week, and I didn't understand any of it. I had no experience in that field, and I got there, and it was a large institution. People were being locked up, and I couldn't understand what had happened. Why was this? And these were people that I would walk in and have a cup of coffee with, sit down and chat, and yet they were under lock and key. And the whole idea was that if their behavior became fussy or people were disturbed by it, that I was to write a program to control it. And that was my mission, and I never did very well with it.
Why not?
I just couldn't understand. One of the first things that happened to me was a man who, and I understood this perfectly, liked to drink a coffee, and they had used a coffee as a reward for him for in-seat behavior in his day-wasting program.
For what kind of behavior?
In-seat, which is a vital skill. And here's this man in his mid-20s, and he was sorting plastic chips into buckets, and he was expected to do that all day, and he occasionally would get up and wander, and so to reinforce him, they were giving him coffee. Problem was, he really liked the coffee. Started running into offices, stealing it from people, and it was a bit of a health hazard, because he would take like a pot of coffee that was really hot and just spill it all over himself. He could get burned. There's a little meeting about, well, how are we going to control this? And people had been escorting him arm in arm around the building so that he wouldn't do this. And he got seriously hurt at one point in a struggle over it.
He was getting no coffee at this point?
Well, he could have one at break and one at lunch, and 3 cups a day, which is all anyone needs.
Are you being facetious?
Yes, of course. I mean, some of us have 3 cups before we get out of bed, if we can arrange it. So, here's this man struggling to get something, and they wanted to struggle back. And it seemed that was awfully naive. What I asked them to do was go over to the shopping center, buy Mr. Coffee, go to the market, buy the coffee, teach him how to make it. And this way he would have coffee machine there, he would learn that you drink coffee when you want it and when it's available, and you don't have to steal. And he stopped stealing. But people get very resentful that why should he have a coffee machine when we don't? And the program got discontinued. What I should have done was taken the people who were providing the services over to the shopping center and bought them a coffee machine.
So what finally happened to the man?
It was interesting. They stopped that. They said it's unfair. Why should he have coffee when no one else has the coffee, et cetera, et cetera. And they took it away, and he did not go back to being so aggressive. It was almost as if, having learned enough, having had coffee on his own terms for enough, that he went back to having it at the times they controlled for him and accommodated, which is too bad.
So is the message there that we can allow somebody to have control in their lives for a while, and then we can take it back away from them, and it'll be okay?
No. I think I see it more as the generosity of spirit for some people, that they've learned that once in a while you get what you want in life, and it's worth hanging in there for. Yeah, that's a dangerous story in a lot of ways, for just the moral you drew. But my interest was not to control his drinking coffee. My interest was to provide him again with the kind of setting where, there's no coffee shortage where he lived. It was to teach him that if you need something in this world and it's available, get it.
But if the rules of a particular company where he was working is that people can drink coffee when they have their break and they can't drink coffee at other times, aren't we enabling him to live a more normal life if he follows the same rules everybody else does?
Mm-hmm. That's a very powerful argument, except that the so-called company he worked for was a state institution. He was not getting any money. He was living under lock and key. It was a non-paid training program. What did he get? Furthermore, he was not only working at a job he didn't choose, and I don't think particularly liked. It wasn't even a job. It was meaningless. These plastic chips, living in a place with 29 other men that all he had in common was society's labor, and then to turn around and say, but if he were to get a job out in the community, then he would be expected to do that. So we'll start that now. I would like to see what would he be like if. First off, let's get him out there. And if he's running around, if he's working for IBM or some reputable corporation and running around stealing things, stealing coffee, that's going to be pretty damaging to his reputation. And it's there that you could establish the context that here we drink at break. But most of the jobs I've had, you can pretty much drink coffee when you feel like it.
Yeah. Is it reasonable in your mind to assume that if somebody's behavior is not meeting our standards and we think dangerous in a very restrictive setting, that they're not ready to go into a less restrictive setting?
Oh, that is one of the worst snares in the business. It's in fact the people who what they're saying is they're not ready to live in an institution, and what they need is to get out and get into a much more typical place. One of the powerful contributors of behavior modification is that the environment is a strong teacher. So why would you expect somebody living 50 miles from nowhere to understand social behavior when they have no models for it?
Have you had direct experience with individuals whose behavior was a very serious problem when they were living in an institutional setting, and where that behavior became a much less serious problem when they moved into a more normalized kind of setting?
Sure. Many times.
Could you talk about a couple of those?
Gentleman who was breaking glass all the time, doing it with his head, and he was getting to the point where he was near death, or he was near to dying because there was nothing left to stitch.
Where was he living at the time?
When I met him, he was living in a little tract house in the suburb, and he had been a ward of the state, grown up in an institution also. And he got there, and they did the same things in this house that they were doing in the institution. The behavior was identical. And it was... The interesting turning point for him was two things. One was, I didn't know him, so I wasn't going to talk to him about this, but I asked, who feels closest to him, most comfortable. Talk to him, ask him, why do you break these Why do you go through windows? And very sociable young man. And a woman asked him, and he said, I don't know. He said, nobody ever asked, which was bad. And the next thing we asked him was, they asked him, was, given that breaking glass seems to be important to you, is there some way you can do it safely? Because we don't really care about the glass if it comes to that. It's you, which is something they never said to him. And he came up with an idea of taking jelly jars and wrapping them up in a newspaper, putting them in a paper bag and stomping on them. And so he had broken glass, but had been safely. I would never have invented that. It was by asking him. And he taught us how he could live more calmly.
To the behavior of breaking glass with his head stuck.
And I don't know where he learned that, but somewhere in his head that meant it was a satisfying experience. So it's, instead of wrestling with him about, we'll keep you away from doing it, it's provide people what they want, but do it in a way that doesn't make them look foolish or doesn't get them hurt. That doesn't seem like such a very complicated concept to me, but for some reason it's been hard for people see that somehow as giving in or making concessions or admitting defeat, when I'm seeing it as a way of learning how to cooperate with people that we haven't taken the time to understand very well.
Realistically, aren't there many people who don't have disabilities, who are doing jobs they hate, who are living in situations they don't like because of financial realities and because of lack of skills? That's an extension of the argument that people sometimes give me to, and is, well, if we do this for this one person, then we'd have to do it for everyone, and we can't, so let's not do it for anyone. And I'm not sure that the culture profits from having any group of people oppressed on the strength of a label. And yes, there are, of course, there are people who are leading lives of noisy desperation everywhere, but they're not looking to human services to support their lives. And although if they did, it might refresh their perspective. But, I mean, the larger social problem is how to empower people to feel more confident. But I'm talking about people who are looking, say, to me. I certainly am not going to endorse putting someone in a situation that's unpleasant for them when I know otherwise and could do otherwise. Let me run a scenario by you that I was involved with. There was a young man who'd come out of a state hospital and who was attending, he was in the last couple of years of his high school program, and he had learned to smoke, needed to smoke, and was very unhappy if he couldn't smoke. And it was it was one of the most important things in his life, was that he had access to cigarettes and that he could in fact smoke. And the school said, well, we have rules. Nobody here is allowed to smoke. If we're going to treat this young man normally, number one, we can't allow him to smoke. Number two, if we allow him to smoke, we're going to have to let everybody else smoke. And number three, we're going to really be stigmatizing him if we allow him to do things that nobody else can do. So what happened was an ongoing battle went on about the cigarettes. He was not allowed to smoke. He kept running away to try to have a cigarette. Eventually the young man returned to the state institution because his behavior got worse and worse.
So in Minnesota you can be incarcerated for smoking?
If you do it in the wrong building, actually, you can. But no, I think the view of the people was, these are reasonable expectations. If this young man is going to grow up at all normally, he's going to have to learn to follow the rules. These are the rules in this school. We're not going to change them for him. So, he wasn't reinstitutionalized because he smoked. He was reinstitutionalized because his behavior got worse and worse as their behavior got worse and worse.
Yes.
How do you react to that, Herb?
Well, a couple of things. First off, the teachers never went into the student lavatory, ever. I mean, the boys' room, he was the only student in the school that ever smoked.
He was the only student with a disability that ever smoked.
So he was probably much more likely to get caught than other kids. The other kids were smoking, they just weren't being found.
He had several objectives on his IEP that addressed the whole issue of him smoking, or not smoking in school. Data were taken regularly.
Yes, well, when in doubt, take data. Well, I'll tell you, the first off, that's a that's a rule. If the school wants to establish that and get away with it, it's not such a bizarre thing that anyone would lose sleep. The problem is that all the other kids coming to that school have come out of more or less typical families, whatever they are, and had a lot of experience as to what social expectations are. And not only do they understand social expectations, they understand the payoffs for adhering to them. This guy's coming out of an institution where basically life revolves around cigarettes and coffee. And that holds true for the people who work there, as well as for the people who live there, in my experience. So that you'd be, I can't think of an analogy. What you're doing is you've given this man the one quality to life that makes it satisfying for him, or endurable even, and saying, well, you can't do that here because it would be stigmatizing. What the guy would need is a lot of experience on understanding that there are things out there in the world that are worth having, other things than cigarettes. And so that if you know why you go 6 hours of a school day without a cigarette, because you're going to get all these other riches, other benefits, that would have been much easier for him to understand. Whereas these other kids had not been locked away for years on end, had not been taught to smoke, or probably had access to a lot of other recreations that smoking had been the one sum total of for him. Does that make sense?
But on a concrete level, what does that all mean about the school's behavior? What does that mean? They allow him to smoke or to drink coffee during class, or to act in other ways which are not considered generally acceptable while you're working on that? Or
this was some kind of finishing school where people were learning party manners?
It's high school.
Okay. Not what I learned in high school, certainly. If their real goal was to teach kids, and this guy has a very special history. I mean, he's had a different history from the other kids. If he had come in speaking Cambodian, would they have insisted that he only speak English perfectly or not at all?
Unfortunately, that many times is true.
Wow. Okay, my interest for someone who came in speaking another language would be to recognize they probably don't have a lot of English. Teach it to them. And it would have been much more interesting to teach this guy why we don't smoke here, why that's an issue here. But meanwhile, since it is for you, let's find some way to accommodate this. The teachers didn't smoke in the building either?
They were teachers.
Yeah. And, it's recognizing individual histories and needs that makes a lot of sense to me, as opposed to just saying, well, if we're going to make everyone normal, then everyone has to conform as of January 1st. Life doesn't work that way.
Let me give you another example, which, again, is a real example. A young woman who had her expressive language was very difficult to understand, and she was just really developing her expressive language. She was 14 years old at the time. And the teachers became very concerned because when they would try to engage her in conversation, many times she wouldn't, as they put it, talk about what they wanted to talk about. And so they would keep working with her to try to get her to talk about what they wanted to talk about. And then oftentimes her behavior would get very bad, and then she'd have to be put into timeout because she was beginning to bang things and throw things because she wouldn't talk about what they wanted to talk about. How does that situation at all exemplify some of your concerns about the ways in which traditionally we have dealt with the needs of people with severe or profound disabilities?
Yeah, I mean that's just, oh my word. I taught high school. I found it not uncommon for students not to want to talk about what I wanted to talk about, and I somehow got around that without recourse to a timeout room. It's why do people lose perspective on what they're trying to achieve to the point of abusing people? It's if this girl who's got a different learning style, has a different history, and is at that point in her life learning something, why not celebrate that? Why not go with that? And the fact that she was talking at all would be very exciting, and support her, and just having the experience of having speech come from inside her out, as opposed to being told that it's something you parrot back and that we put into you. and that loss, and then to punish her for not wanting to collaborate with that agenda is very, very, that's disturbing.
Well, parents oftentimes at this point find themselves in the position of advocating for either their child or their adult offspring in trying to encourage staff to become more flexible and to become more responsive to the choices that the person makes. Would you have any advice or recommendations to parents as to how they can help encourage staff, help teach staff to become more flexible in their approach and to be more willing to respect the choices that are made by the person who has a disability?
Just one really common sense strategy is to ask people, what do you want to accomplish here? Because as I say, a lot of times in this work, people end up arguing about how to do things, and we forget entirely, well, what is it we're trying to do? And what are you trying to teach this person? What do you want to see in 5 years? If, irrespective of how you go about it, what's the picture going to look like? And oftentimes people will say, well, we're putting this person into timeout so that they'll have better social skills. There's something wrong with that sentence. And it's usually easier for people to realize maybe my goals and my means can be congruent, and they don't have to be so antithetic. They're oppositional. So if we really are, for instance, if you really are trying to teach the person good social skills, the value of cooperation, then maybe the best way to teach that would be modeling and asking people, well, for parents and for teachers alike, I think asking each other, well, what are we trying to do here, and does it really fit in with our attitude towards this person? I really don't know how you can throw someone into a timeout room and say that you're doing it for their own good. I mean, it's pretty clearly designed to take away an irritating stimulus from the people doing the service. I don't know what you're teaching the person when you do that, except that people bigger than you can have their way.
In your opinion, Herb, is behavior modification, which is implemented by providing negative kinds of consequences to a person who doesn't do what we want them to do or what we think they should do, is that always inappropriate?
Always is a loaded word. I would defer to Dr. Skinner, who just recently said that he just didn't see why you would use punishment, why you would use negative strategies for people if you're trying to teach them. He said his life has been dedicated, he's 83 now, that his life has been dedicated to advancing the power of positive reinforcement. And if you're going to, if you believe the founder of the whole thing, then the answer to that is no, you don't ever need to do that.
Well, if you make a token available to a person when they behave in a particular way.
Now, this is a person who's going to go on a subway.
No, I'm talking about traditional kinds of chits or a little piece of cardboard that's got a happy face on it, whatever that can be used to purchase something else. If you've got something, whatever kind of an economy, well, let me back up. Can I assume from your reaction that sort of traditional token economies are not what you consider to be a very appropriate way of providing instruction?
Well, if you could go into McDonald's and turn in 5 happy faces for a cheeseburger, then it would make sense to me. But why are we teaching people these artificial things when what we've said is they have trouble learning one thing? Why would you make them learn to do that as well as to manage real money? I mean, the point would be to teach people skills and have experiences that are out there. The implication of that being you go out there to teach it too.
Well, let's change it a little. Let's make it a little bit different then. Let's assume that we give somebody a quarter if their behavior reaches a certain standard for a half-hour period a day. And we give them the quarter if they act in the way we've set out, and we withhold the quarter if they don't. Is that positive reinforcement or is that punishment?
I think it's degrading is the issue. I have a good friend who's 45 who, if she's good, a good girl, as she explains it, for a week, she gets to go for coffee with her supervisor. Now, I mean, if you left her IQ out of that, story and sent it into Ms. Magazine, would they say, "Oh, this sounds like a useful strategy for teaching social behavior"? I mean, it's insulting, and I'm really not interested in almost whether it's because there are all the technology of behavior modification can get so that you can't tell whether it's a positive punishment or a negative reinforcement. But all that aside, it's what's the context for that? I mean, to whom are you giving this quarter for good behavior? It would seem more socially real to me that people value one another to the extent that they respond to each other out of respect for the person, not for the quarter. And if the person doesn't have that, then the implication from that is then you need to teach this person that people are valuable and worth having around.
So how do you use behavior modification in a way that isn't degrading or insulting to the persons whose behavior you're trying to shape?
I think trying to shape someone else's behavior tends to be pretty condescending. In a programmatic way. I mean, in a socially natural way, that's something we do all the time. The way behavior modification seems most powerful to me is in teaching things. Programmed instruction, little computer programs where that start out with very simple questions, or even books, or talking, where you ask people very simple questions, they get the answer, and you say, "Yep, you got that one, terrific, let's go on to this." And you lead people through programmed instruction, through very complicated things that they might not have learned. That's very powerful, and that's in the context of a teacher. Teacher-student. I mean, if I'm the teacher, I have this information, I want you to have it. It doesn't have to be condescending, but I do have a slight edge on that relationship. But for social behavior, which a lot of these behavior modification programs do, I think it's rude. It just doesn't make sense.
So if you've got a child or an adult who frequently either hits himself or hits other people, are you saying that behavior modification is not an appropriate way to address that behavior?
It could be. It's not my first response.
What is?
Find out, well, what kind of a life does this person lead that beating up other people or yourself makes sense? Because if you think, I tend to think that most people do things to make themselves feel better or to feel at least comfortable, and they don't do things to be hurtful. They certainly don't do things to make their lives more unpleasant on purpose. So if you start with that, then you have to ask, well, where did this start making sense to them? And you look at the lives of people who hurt themselves or other people, and typically it starts off as something very minor, and people decide, we're going to draw the line here and we'll control it. And the person says, well, it's almost as if they say, sure, go ahead. And it escalates and escalates and escalates, and as we've been saying, the worse your behavior is, the worse the service behavior becomes. To the point where there are places in North America where people are routinely tied up, routinely subjected to cattle prods, ammonia in their noses, and all of this is under the bland name of reversives, but it's basically, if it need be, will inflict pain on you to control you.
What does the word control mean to you?
You do it because it's my idea. And I really don't care if you understand why I want you to do it or not. As opposed to cooperation where, do you understand why this is useful? I really want this. What do you think? And we hammer it out.
But do you have the luxury of that kind of a dialogue if you've got somebody who is currently dangerous to other people and hurtful to other people?
Yep. It's just, what you do in an emergency. If I walked into a room and somebody was about to hurt themselves, I probably would physically restrain them on the spot. But I wouldn't call that a program. I'd call that an emergency intervention. I mean, if you're doing that for years on end, you may question. Yeah, there's people do. You may question, well, why do you think that's an interesting intervention all the time?
Can you give an example of a real-life situation you've been involved with where a person was engaging in some fairly serious and dangerous behavior, and you or people that you were familiar with were able to intervene and help that person to change that behavior without having to use a quote-unquote behavior modification approach?
Yeah. Gentleman that I got to meet, he was living in a 78-bed ICF, banging his face with his fist in a real way. I was told, I didn't count, up to 1,000 times a day. And they tried drugs, they tried tokens, they tried all of these ways to control him. And the next step was to mechanically restrain his arms to his waist on his belt, wrist strap. The short version of that story is basically what we did was we spend a day asking, where's this guy been? Who has he seen? What do you think he thought? Put it into words. So what are the characteristics of this man? And people came up with wonderful things like, he was isolated, he was lonely, he was chronically misunderstood. So if that's the case, what do you need? You need people to listen to you, and then who are these people going to be? And it turned out that his family really liked him, but they were used as a reinforcer for good behavior, and then they restricted visits because it wasn't working. So they thought they were contributing. So we got him re-hooked up with his family. Some friends used to take him horseback riding. He had real foods that he liked. Just let's make a life here that makes sense.
How long did that process take?
The planning took a day. For him to respond to it took about a week.
So within a week?
I'm not saying he went to zero, because I don't know that. They called and said that the dramatic change of just their attitude toward him, of asking him, do you want to take your bath now? Just little things like that he started responding much more directly. He did not have language, by the way. And this guy feels much better.
And for how long, if you know, had they been trying to use more typical behavior management kinds of techniques in getting rid of the self-injurious behavior?
He was 19 when I met him, so he'd had a good 10 years of it. By the way, the one part of that story I don't like is the idea that fast-acting, effective, do this in 1 week, everything will work. My interest was not necessarily to make him do anything. My interest was the life he was living was unbearable, and he had to have a life that was worth getting out of bed for. And my hunch was that once you have a life that's worth having, you don't beat your face. That was only a hunch. And I would not have said, well, gee, the horseback riding didn't work, so let's stop that and go to drugs again.
In your opinion, is it when you're using the approach that you just described, where you really try to give a person choices and you treat them with respect, and you treat them with respect for their choices, do you continue to gather data, or are data not helpful in that kind of situation?
If you can do it in a way that doesn't interfere with the person, I mean, if you're sitting there with a clipboard staring at them, that says something. But if you have an unobtrusive way to do that, I think data is a good way to validate that you feel better about things. Because sometimes programs make us who do the service feel better, but I'm not sure if it has any impact for the person we're concerned about. Sure, data it's not like that's the enemy, it's just that for a lot of people it becomes the obsession.
Keeping in mind the fact that you feel so strongly that the need for individual choices, that individual choices and the need to make them needs to be respected, and that therefore individual decisions need to be made, what 3 or 4 values would you have for the goal or the purpose of the services we provide to people with severe or profound disabilities?
I think my only criterion in the end is that if it's a real service, the person values it, and if they don't, maybe we should stop.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.